Well, welcome to Reading Canada, an afternoon of Canadian literature, a Canada semester event featuring members and friends of Sigma Tau Delta, the International English Honor Society. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. I'm Amy Gates, Associate Professor of English and the advisor of our local chapter of Sigma Tau Delta. We want to thank Dr. Chad Stebbins for supporting Sigma Tau Delta's participation in the international theme semesters, including readings like this, and our annual fall book club featuring selections from the theme country or region. This fall, we are reading The Maid by Nita Prose. I have show and tell items right here. And Scarborough by Catherine Hernandez. And you can find information about both of those book club times and dates in the Canada brochure. I also want to thank this afternoon's readers and Isabel Walker for pulling a lot of strings together while I was out of town. So she made this event happen. Otherwise, it would be a much crazier experience. And now to Canada. If we know nothing else about our neighbor to the north, we probably know Canada is huge. Even so, my students this semester have been surprised when they learn how huge. 10 million square kilometers, or approximately 3.86 million square miles, stretching across 6 time zones from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, from the border it shares with the United States to the high Arctic. In terms of area, only Russia is larger. However, only 39 million people approximately live in Canada, meaning that in terms of population, Canada is larger than Australia, but smaller than California. Most Canadians speak either English or French as their first language, but more than 1 in 5 have another language as their first, primarily Mandarin and Cantonese, but also Punjabi, Tagalog, Spanish, and Arabic, according to Donald Wright's Canada, A Very Short Introduction, published in 2020, which I have relied on extensively for my remarks. Wright tells us that students in the Toronto District School Board speak 126 different languages. In terms of religion, Christianity in general and Roman Catholicism in particular continue to have the most adherents by far, but nearly 1 million Canadians now observe Ramadan, making Islam Canada's fastest growing religion. And of course, there are many other religions. In short, as Wright tells us, Canada is one of the most ethnically, linguistically, and religiously diverse countries on the planet. The historian Ramsay Cook resisted the temptation many historians and other observers have had to define Canada, encouraging people to think instead about Canada as a country that has been made and remade over time, not as a country with an essential identity to be defined, encircled, and defended, as Wright puts it. Cook encouraged people to see Canada's history as plural, not singular, as a country with multiple and sometimes competing identities, and with a history that includes everyone, Indigenous and settler, French and English, men and women, queer and straight, Black and white, European and Asian, African and West Indian, Italian workers and Mennonite farmers, Cook believed, are as important as heads of industry, business, and government. And Canadian governance is complex too. In law, it is one nation and only Ottawa can speak for Canada, but in fact, Wright, it is 3 nations, English Canada, Quebec, and First Nations. And I'll add, it is in fact even more complicated because the Canadian government recognizes 3 separate groups of Indigenous peoples, First Nations, Inuit, and Métis. Archaeological finds indicate that humans have occupied what is now Canada for 24,000 years. The Norse arrived some 500 years before Englishman John Cabot, who with his crew made landfall in Newfoundland on June 24th, 1497. Portuguese, Norman, Breton, French, Basque, and English fishers soon traveled to the area and developed inshore and offshore fisheries. And less than 40 years after Cabot's landing, French explorer Jacques Cartier was making further explorations and claiming more land. As Wright reminds us, 500 years later, the Indigenous, non-Indigenous relationship is still fraught, especially over land. In 1967, Canada celebrated the 100th anniversary of Confederation. The 1960s saw the Quiet Revolution in Quebec as it became more secular, assertive, and separatist. The other quiet revolution of the 1960s saw English Canada replace its definition of Canada as British with a new definition of Canada as bilingual and multicultural. And Indigenous Canada also experienced its own revolution in the 1960s and 70s as it questioned the premise of bilingualism and began asserting its rights more forcefully in creative writing as well as in negotiations and protests. For instance, Indigenous poet Jeanette Armstrong, in History Lesson, published in 1979, depicts the devastation of the, quote, mob that bursts from out of the belly of Christopher's ship. And Maria Campbell describes in her 1973 memoir, Half-Breed, the poverty, racism, and violence she experienced as a Métis woman in Canada. In 1960, writer Hugh MacLennan characterized how American readers thought of Canadian books at the time. I quote, "Boy meets girl in Winnipeg, and who cares?" End quote. That attitude shifted in the 1960s as change occurred rapidly on so many fronts. Writers in Canada such as Leonard Cohen, Mordecai Richler, Margaret Lawrence, Alice Munro, Michael Ondaatje, and Margaret Atwood joined and often helped shape those conversations. This new dynamic group of Canadian writers, assisted by Canadian publishers, had, according to Wright, interesting things to say about diversity, identity, sexuality, and the accommodation of difference. Canadian literature, or CanLit, had become a national and recognizable literature, with its own literary giants, key texts, and recurring themes. Since the mid-20th century, millions of people from around the globe have immigrated to Canada, adding still more storytelling voices and nuances to what it means to be Canadian and to write and read Canadian literature. In the preface to her 2024 book, The Routledge Introduction to Canadian Crime Fiction, Pamela Bador suggests that in various ways, and I quote, writers reveal the gaps between Canada's self-definitions and its realities, repeatedly exploring not only the contradictions of Canada's national ethos in an increasingly globalized world, but also the desire of Canada and Canadians to revisit and even revise our understanding of the past as we imagine and seek a better future. End quote. She writes specifically of Canadian crime fiction writers, but I would suggest her words apply to Canadian writers more broadly as well. Clearly, this introduction and selection of readings we will share today cannot do justice to the multiplicity of voices who have been telling and continue to tell stories and share poems in what is now Canada. While we will be sharing the work of many wonderful Canadian authors, we are leaving out so many others, some of whom you might actually expect to hear. We hope you will be inspired to check out the Canada Semester shelf on the third floor of Spivell Library. That's one floor down from where we are right now. Look for lists of Canadian literature that can be found online, including the CBC's Canada Reads website, and explore the dazzling and complex ecosystem of Canadian literature. To begin, please help me welcome Montse Rodriguez.
Hello, everybody. My name is Montse Rodriguez. I am a senior majoring in literary studies. I'm also the secretary for MSSU's chapter of Sigma Tau Delta, and I am also an editor for Bordertown, the school's undergraduate literary journal. I will be reading some of the older selections that we will have today, which I think provide a glimpse into different perspectives regarding Canada, specifically around its conception and later independence. The first text I will be reading is an excerpt from Susanna Moody's Roughing It in the Bush. Moody was born in 1803 in England, but she emigrated to Canada in 1832. She had been already widely published while in Britain and continued to write after she settled in Upper Canada. Roughing It in the Bush was first published in 1852 and provided a somber contrast to the idealized image British advertisers and land sellers had created of the brand new settlements in Canada. The disorientation, change in culture, and physical demands that came with the settlers' new lives were all explored from Moody's first-hand experiences and observations. The following excerpt is from the introduction to Roughing It in the Bush, again written by Susanna Moody. In 1830, the great tide of emigration flowed westward. Canada became the great landmark for the rich in hope and poor in purse. Public newspapers and private letters teemed with the unheard of advantages to be derived from a settlement in this highly favored region. Its salubrious climate, its fertile soil, commercial advantages, great water privileges, its proximity to the mother country, and last, not least, its almost total exemption from taxation, were the theme of every tongue and lauded beyond all praise. The general interest, once excited, was industriously kept alive by pamphlets published by interested parties, which prominently set forth all of the good to be derived from a settlement in the backwoods of Canada, while they carefully concealed the toil and hardship to be endured in order to secure these advantages. O ye dealers in wild lands, ye speculators in the folly and credulity of your fellow men, what a mass of misery and of misrepresentation productive of that misery have you not to answer for? Next, I will read a poem written by Frank L. Pollock titled The Trail of Gold. Pollock was born in 1876, though it is debated whether it was in the United States or in Canada. He did spend most of his life between Ontario and Toronto and implemented Canadian landscapes into many of his works. I found this poem in the collection titled A Treasury of Canadian Verse that we actually have in the library, selected and edited by Theodore H. Rand and published in 1969. The poem discusses what is now called the Klondike Gold Rush, which occurred between 1896 and 1899. This was a massive movement of people, obviously in search of gold, from all over the world to the Klondike region of Yukon in the northwestern area of Canada, almost bordering Alaska. As you can probably guess by the area, conditions were not great. Between the extreme cold, the unfamiliar landscape, and even disease spread in the settlements that the miners created, it is no surprise that many lost their lives and most actually left penniless. So knowing that, here is The Trail of Gold by Frank L. Pollock. Under the ward of the polar star, where the great auroras snap and blaze, there are crashing blows on the icy bar that is set at the end of the open ways. There are axes ringing across the crest, the sluices shackle the streams that rolled, as the gamesters gather from east and west, the men that follow the trail of gold. A black line crawls over the glacier's face, where the worn pack horses scrape and slide. The muskeg swallows and leaves no trace. The boats go down in the snow-swelled tide. Blood and bones on the snow and sod, from the canyon's black to the barren's gray, blaze the trail that the vanguard trod, that those who follow may find the way. There are strange ships west of the lonely isles, where the red volcanoes burn and freeze. There's a fading wake over the misty miles. There are smokes that trouble the smoky seas. There are corpses swept from the sinking hull, as the steamer dips to the swelling gale, for the rising shark and the wheeling gull that hunt the sea on the golden trail. The storm sweeps out from its polar den till the air grows dense with the cutting snow. The north makes mock of the sons of men, as the diggers lie in the drifts below. The workers lie where the last work ceased. The strong men scatter the lifeless wold, and the tall wolves howl at the gathered feast, the hounds that hunt on the scent of gold. Finally, I will read two poems by Canadian poet and author Lorna Crozier. Crozier was born in 1948 in the province of Saskatchewan, where she has lived most of her life. Having grown up in a prairie community as the daughter to farmers, Crozier implements a lot of rural Canada into her poetry. She has published several collections of poems, including Angels of Flesh, Angels of Silence, published in 1988, which the poems that I will be reading are from. So the first poem is titled, The Sky at Twilight. The sky at twilight is a tender beauty. We've been traveling. I've been sick. Now we're home again. The first day I helped you plant the garden, dug holes for 50 gladioli. They were the favorites of my grandmother, flowers of resurrection. One wilts, another opens on the long stem. Flowers of dying in stages. Make sure, you said, the right side up before you cover them. Last week in another country, I was cold and sick. Desire left my body. It pulled away like birds leaving the jacaranda trees, flying north to our cottonwoods in spring. Today, the bulbs buried in the earth begin to awaken from their deep sleep. They have a dumb patience, like our bodies when they are ill, asexual and tender, twilight giving way to dark. A week ago, I had to lean on you to walk. Now we hold one another in the upstairs room, the bulbs in the garden, each turned right side up. And lastly, the second poem that I will read from Crozier, is titled Without Hands. It does have an epigraph that contains some context for the poem, so I will read that first, and then the poem, everything as Lorna Crozier wrote it. In memory of Victor Jara, the Chilean musician whose hands were smashed by the military to stop him from playing his guitar and singing for his fellow prisoners in the Santiago Stadium. Along with thousands of others, he was tortured and finally killed there in September 1973. Without hands. All the machines in the world stop. The textile machines, the paper machines, the machines in the mines turning stones to fire. Without hands to touch them, spoons, forks, and knives forget their names and uses. The baby is not bathed. Bread rises on the stove, overflows the bowl. Without hands, the looms stop. The music stops. The plums turn sweet and sticky and gather flies. Without hands, without those beautiful conjunctions, those translators of skin, bone, hair, 2 eyes go blind. 2 pale hounds sniffing ahead and doubling back to tell us of hot and cold, or the silk of roses after rain are lost. 2 terns feeling the air in every feather are shut down. Without hands, my father doesn't plant potatoes row on row, doesn't build a house for wrens, or carry me from the car to bed when I pretend I'm sleeping. On wash days, my mother doesn't hang clothes. On the line, she doesn't turn the pages of a book and read out loud, or teach me how to lace my shoes. Without hands, my small grandmother doesn't pluck the chicken for a Sunday meal, or every evening, before she goes to sleep, brush and brush her long white hair. Thank you.
Hello, my name is Caitlin Eisenhower, and I'm a non-traditional senior English Literary Studies major. I am also a registered nurse and have worked in a NICU for 4 years. I came back to school in pursuit of an English degree because I greatly enjoy English and literature. Since coming back to school, I am very grateful to have received the Charlotte and Randy Hopper Award. Today, I get to do a reading from the Canadian author L.M. Montgomery. Lucy Maud Montgomery was born on November 30th in 1874 in Clifton, Prince Edward Island, Canada, and was first published for her writing just before her 16th birthday in 1890. Her first novel to be published was Anne of Green Gables in 1908. Montgomery's novel sold more than 19,000 copies in the first 5 months and was reprinted 10 times within that first year. Since its release, Anne of Green Gables has had many different adaptations from movies and musicals, TV series, and even a graphic novel that you can check out from our very own Spivey Library. Anne of Green Gables is a children's novel, and it has 2 sequels. Montgomery and her book are known and loved by many different people all around the world. She became the first Canadian woman to be made a member of the British Royal Society of Arts in 1923. Before her death in 1942, Montgomery wrote 21 novels, 2 poetry collections, and over 500 short stories. She is a beloved author that has made an insurmountable impact on the children's literature genre. Today, I will be reading an excerpt from her first novel, Anne of Green Gables. So we're going to go to chapter 16, which is Diana is invited to tea with tragic results. October was a beautiful month at Green Gables, when the birches in the hollow turned as golden as sunshine, and the maples behind the orchard were royal crimson, and the wild cherry trees along the lane put on the loveliest shades of dark red and bronzy green, while the fields sunned themselves in the aftermath. Anne reveled in the world of color about her. "Oh, Marilla," she exclaimed one Saturday morning, coming dancing in with her arms full of gorgeous bows. "I'm so glad to live in a world where there are Octobers." It would be terrible if we just skipped from September to November, wouldn't it? Look at these maple branches. Don't they give you just a thrill? Several thrills? I'm going to decorate my room with them. Messy things, said Marilla, whose aesthetic sense was not noticeably developed. You clutter up your room entirely too much with out-of-doors stuff. Anne, bedrooms are made to sleep in. Oh, and dream in too, Marilla. And you know one can dream so much better in a room where there are pretty things. I'm going to put these bows in the old blue jug and set them on my table. Mind you, don't drop the leaves all over the stairs then. I'm going on a meeting of the Aid Society at Carmody this afternoon, Anne, and I won't likely be home before dark. You'll have to get Marilla or Matthew and Jerry their supper. So mind you don't forget to put the tea to draw until you sit down at the table as you did last time. It was dreadful of me to forget, said Anne apologetically. But that was the afternoon I was trying to think of a name for the violet veil, and it crowded all the other things out. Matthew was so good. He never scolded me a bit. He put the tea down himself and said we could wait a while as well as not. And I told him a lovely fairy story while we were waiting, so he didn't find the time long at all. It was a beautiful fairy story, Marilla. I forgot the end of it, so I made it up, and I made up the end for myself, and Matthew said he couldn't tell where the join came in. Matthew would think it all right, Anne, if you took up a notion to get up and have dinner in the middle of the night. But you keep your wits about you this time, and I don't know really if I'm doing right, but it may make you more addle-padded than ever, but you can ask Diana to come over and spend the afternoon with you and have tea here. Oh, Marilla, Anne clasped her hands. How perfectly lovely. You are able to imagine things after all, or else you never would have understood how I've longed for that very thing. It will seem so nice and grown-up-ish. No fear of me forgetting to put the tea to draw when I have company. Oh, Marilla, can I use the rosebud spray tea set? No, indeed. The rosebud tea set? Well, what next then? You know I never use that except for the minister or for the aides. You'll put down the old brown tea set, but you can open the little yellow crock of cherry preserves. It's time it's being used anyhow. I believe it's beginning to go. And you can cut some fruitcake and have some of the cookies and snaps. I can just imagine myself sitting down at the head of the table and pouring out tea, Anne said, shuddering her eyes ecstatically, and asking Diana how she takes her sugar. I know she doesn't, but of course I'll ask her just as if I didn't know. And then pressing her to take another piece of fruitcake and another helping of preserves. Oh, Marilla, it's a wonderful sensation just to think of it. Can I take her into the spare room and lay off her hat when she comes in, and then to the parlor to sit? No, is the answer to that question.
Hi, everybody. My name is Nancy Jamie. I am from Miami, Oklahoma. I am a senior, and I am a transfer student from NEO A&M College. I'm in the honors program. I'm also the vice president of our chapter of Sigma Tau Delta. I'm an English literary studies major, so I've studied a lot of American and British literature, but this event was a great opportunity to expand my horizons and explore Canadian literature. I will be reading an excerpt from Boys and Girls by Alice Munro. Munro was born Alice Ann Laidlaw in Wingham, Ontario, Canada, on July 10, 1931. She was the eldest child of Robert Eric Laidlaw, a fox farmer, and Anne Clark Chamney Laidlaw, a former school teacher. She was the 1949 class valedictorian of her high school and also received a scholarship for 2 years at the University of Western Ontario in London, having the highest standing in English of any student who applied there. Beginning her studies at Western that autumn, Alice Laidlaw initially studied journalism, but shifted to honors English for her second year and won that year's prize for the best grades in the major. In the spring of 1950, her first published story appeared in Folio, the undergraduate literary magazine. That story, The Dimensions of a Shadow, would be followed by 2 more there. She would meet and marry her first husband, James Munro, here. Eventually, she became the first Canadian to win the Nobel Prize for Literature in 2013, among many other honors. In 2024, Monroe's youngest daughter revealed that she had been sexually assaulted as a child by Monroe's second husband, Gerald Fremling, and that Monroe chose to stay with and protect them despite knowing about the abuse. It is important to acknowledge her controversies, but her contributions to literature cannot be denied, and that is why she has been included in today's reading. Monroe died May 13, 2024, in Port Hope, Ontario, at the age of 92. Boys and Girls was first published in 1968 in the Montrealer before it was collected with 14 other stories and published in Alice Munro's first edition of short stories, Dance of the Happy Shades. The story, narrated by a young girl, details the time in her life when she leaves childhood and its freedoms behind and realizes that to be a girl is to be eventually a woman. My father was a fox farmer. That is, he raised silver foxes in pens. And in the fall and early winter, when their fur was prime, he killed them and skinned them and sold their pelts to the Hudson's Bay Company or the Montreal fur traders. Alive, the foxes inhabited a world my father made for them. It was surrounded by a high guard fence, like a medieval town, with a gate that was padlocked at night. He had fitted a tin drum on a wheelbarrow for bringing water down to the pens. This was my job in the summer, when the foxes had to have water twice a day, between 9 and 10 o'clock in the morning and again after supper. Laird, my younger brother, came too, with his little cream and green gardening can filled too full and knocking against his legs and slopping water on his canvas shoes. I had the real watering can, my father's, though I could only carry it 3/4 full. Besides carrying water, I helped my father when he cut the long grass, and the lamb's quarter and flowering money musk that grew between the pens. He cut with the scythe, and I raked into piles. My father did not talk to me unless it was about the job we were doing. In this, he was quite different from my mother, who, if she was feeling cheerful, would tell me all sorts of things. Whatever thoughts and stories my father had were private, and I was shy of him, and I would never ask him questions. Nevertheless, I worked willingly under his eyes and with a feeling of pride. One time, a feed salesman came down into the pens to talk to him, and my father said, "Like to have you meet my new hired hand." I turned away and raked furiously, red in the face with pleasure. "Could have fooled me," said the salesman. "I thought it was only a girl." It seemed to me that work in the house was endless, dreary, and depressing. Work done out of doors and in my father's service was ritualistically important. I wheeled the tank up to the barn where it was kept, and I heard my mother saying, "Wait till Laird gets a little bigger, then you'll have a real help." What my father said I did not hear. I was pleased by the way he stood listening, politely as he would to a salesman or a stranger, but with an air of wanting to get on with his real work. I felt my mother had no business down here, and I wanted him to feel the same way. My mother, I felt, was not to be trusted. She was kinder than my father, and more easily fooled, but you could not depend on her, and the real reasons for the things she said and did were not to be known. She loved me, but she was also my enemy. This winter also I began to hear a great deal more on the theme my mother had sounded when she had been talking in front of the barn. I no longer felt safe. It seemed that in the minds of the people around me there was a steady undercurrent of thought, not to be deflected, on this one subject. It was a fine day, and we were going around the yard picking up tree branches that had been torn off in winter storms. The stable door was open. Henry had just brought Flora, our horse, out, and she had broken away from him. She was running free in the barnyard from one end to the other. My father and Henry ran after her and tried to grab the dangling halter. They tried to work her into a corner, and they had almost succeeded when she made a run between them, wild-eyed, and disappeared round the corner of the barn. We heard the rails clatter down as she got over the fence, and Henry yelled, "She's into the field now." Instead of shutting the gate, I opened it as wide as I could. I did not make any decision to do this. It was just what I did. Flora never slowed down. She galloped straight past me, and Laird jumped up and down, yelling, "Shut it! Shut it!" even after it was too late. It was later than 1 o'clock when the truck came back. The tarpaulin was over the back, which meant there was horse meat in it. My mother had to heat dinner up all over again. We began to pass the bowls of steaming, overcooked vegetables. Laird looked across the table at me and said proudly, distinctly, "It was her fault Flora got away." "What?" my father said. "She could have shut the gate, and she didn't. She just opened it up and Flora ran out." "Is that right?" my father said. Everybody at the table was looking at me. I nodded, swallowing food with great difficulty. To my shame, tears flooded my eyes. My father made a curt sound of disgust. "What did you do that for?" I didn't answer. I put down my fork and waited to be sent from the table, still not looking up. But this did not happen. For some time, nobody said anything. Then Laird said matter-of-factly, "She's crying." "Never mind," my father said. He spoke with resignation, even good humor, the words which absolved and dismissed me for good. "She's only a girl," he said. I didn't protest that, even in my heart. Maybe it was true. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Dr. Hannah Dow, and I'm an assistant professor in the Department of Language and Literature. I teach creative writing, literature, composition, and I'm also a writer myself. This semester, I'm teaching a creative nonfiction course, and last week I had assigned this very short essay by Margaret Atwood to my own students. I connected with this piece because I relate very much to Atwood's persona in the piece, as you'll see, as an overeducated, underexperienced worker. Like the narrator of this essay, I've held many similar jobs, bussing tables, doing kitchen prep, working at a concession stand, help desks, and I've had many similarly humbling and humiliating experiences. So I hope you enjoy, but don't relate to this essay as much as I do. Margaret Atwood is an internationally acclaimed author who was born in Ottawa, Ontario in 1939. She received a bachelor's degree from the University of Toronto in 1961 and a master's degree from Harvard University in 1962. Since the mid-1960s, Atwood has received continuous critical acclaim for more than 30 books of fiction, poetry, essays, literary criticism, and children's literature. She is the recipient of dozens of awards, including most of the major literary prizes in Canada, as well as many from around the world, including the British Booker Prize in 2000 for her novel The Blind Assassin. Atwood is known for her careful craftsmanship, her precision with language, her erudition, and her stinging wit. In Kaching, Atwood wittily describes her first job. So this is Kaching by Margaret Atwood. I'll pass over the mini jobs of adolescence, the summer camp stints that were more like getting paid for having fun. I'll pass over to the self-created pin money generators, the puppet shows put on for kids at office Christmas parties, the serigraph posters turned out on the ping pong table, and turn to my first real job. By real job, I mean one that had nothing to do with friends of my parents or parents of my friends, but was obtained in the adult manner by looking through the ads in newspapers and going in to be interviewed. One for which I was entirely unsuited and that I wouldn't have done except for the money. I was surprised when I got it, underpaid while doing it, and frustrated in the performance of it, and these qualities have remained linked for me to the ominous word job. The year was 1962. The place was Toronto. It was summer, and I was faced with the necessity of earning the difference between my scholarship for the next year and what it would cost me to live. The job was in the coffee shop of a small hotel on Avenue Road. It is now in the process of being torn down, but at that time it was a clean, well-lighted place with booths along one side and a counter, possibly marble, down the other. The booths were served by a waitressing pro who lipsticked outside the lines and who thought I was a mutant. My job would be serving things at the counter. Coffee I would pour, toast I would create from bread, milkshakes I would whip up in the obstetrical stainless steel device provided. Easy as pie, I was told. I would also be running the customer's money through the cash register. An opaque machine with buttons to be pushed, little drawers that shot in and out, and a neurotic system of locks. I said I had never worked a cash register before. This delighted the manager, a plump, unctuous character out of some novel I hadn't yet read. He said the cash register, too, was easy as pie, and I would catch on to it in no time, as I was a smart girl with an MA. He said I should go and get myself a white dress. I didn't know what he meant by white dress. I bought the first thing I could find on sale, a nylon afternoon number with daisies appliqued onto the bodice. The waitress told me this would not do. I needed a dress like her uniform. "How dense can you be?" I overheard her saying. I got the uniform, but I had to go through the first day in my nylon daisies. This first humiliation set the tone. The coffee was easy enough, I just had to keep the bun filled, and the milkshakes were possible. Few people wanted them anyway. The sandwiches and deep-fried shrimp were made at the back. All I had to do was order them over the intercom and bin the leftovers. But the cash register was perverse. Its drawers would pop open for no reason, or it would ring eerily when I swore I was nowhere near it, or it would lock itself shut, and the queue of customers waiting to pay would lengthen and scowl as I wrestled and sweated. I kept expecting to be fired for incompetence, but the manager chortled more than ever. Occasionally, he would bring some man in a suit to view me. "She's got an MA," he would say, in a proud but pitying voice, and the two of them would stare at me and shake their heads. An ex-boyfriend discovered my place of employment and would also come to stare and shake his head, ordering a single coffee, taking an hour to drink it, leaving me with a sardonic nickel tip. The Greek short order cook decided I would be the perfect upfront woman for the restaurant he wanted to open. He would marry me and do the cooking. I would speak English, the clientele, and work, was he mad, the cash register. He divulged his bank balance and demanded to meet my father so the two of them could close the deal. When I declined, he took to phoning me over the intercom to whisper blandishments and to plying me with deep-fried shrimp. A girl as scrawny as myself, he pointed out, was unlikely to get such a good offer again. Then the Shriners hit town, took over the hotel, and began calling for buckets of ice, or for doctors because they'd had heart attacks. Too much tricycle riding in the hot sun was felling them in herds. I couldn't handle the responsibility. The cash register had betrayed me once too often, and the short order cook was beginning to sing Frank Sinatra songs to me. I gave notice. Only when I'd quit did the manager reveal his true stratagem. They'd wanted someone as inept as me because they suspected their real cashier of skimming the accounts, a procedure I was obviously too ignorant to ever figure out. Too stunned, as the waitress put it. She was on the cashier's side and had me fingered as a stoolie all along. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Shelby Post, and I'm a marketing major, and I'm also a senior set to graduate in May. I've been involved with Sigma Tau Delta since the spring semester of last year. I'm also the treasurer. After school, I'm interested in pursuing a career in business consulting or entrepreneurship. I enjoy reading poetry and fantasy fiction. So the first piece that I will be reading is by Kai-Ching Tom. This piece is a poem from Asian Canadian author Kai-Ching Tom's book titled A Place Called No Homeland, which is a collection of poetry. Kai-Ching Tom was born in 1991 in Canada and is a non-binary trans woman who writes numerous styles of literature, including novels and poetry. A Place Called No Homeland was published in 2017 and has received the Stonewall Book Award, Lambda Literary Award, and the Publishing Triangle Award. This work as a whole talks about gender expectations, identity, and survival. The work When You Die discusses ancestry and mentions feelings toward family ties. So I'll begin the poem. It's titled When You Die. I will be chopping vegetables when you die. I chop so many vegetables these days, the way you taught me, blade held slantwise, angled away from the hand. Do you remember my 6-year-old eyes so wide with wonder at the speed with which you sliced? Carrots became orange coins, Potatoes became cubes, like magic. I was mesmerized by how quickly you could cut, how deep. I started working in a kitchen when I was your age, you told me, Cantonese syllables falling short and choppy on my ears, matching the tech, tech, tech of your knife on the cutting board. I saw a man lose a finger once, one careless slice, finger gone, forever. I learned from you that knives can only cut one way. Magic only works one way. You don't get back what you've cut off. So now that we are a continent apart, I will not know it when you die. I'll hear over the phone, perhaps by email after the fact, but the moment itself is lost to me, cut off, cut out, by words and time and geography, all knives. I will be chopping vegetables when you die, nonchalant stream rising from the pot on the stove. And perhaps as you exhale your last breath, close your eyes, go still, and my hand will slip. Blood flowing between carrot slices escaping into my soup where it will taste so salty, so bitter and sweet, the way blood always tastes. So the next pieces are from Rupi Kaur's first book, titled Milk and Honey. It's a pretty popular book. This is a collection of poems and short stories about her life and a journey of healing. Rupi Kaur was born in Punjab, India in 1992 and currently resides in Canada. Milk and Honey was self-published in 2014 as a work of modern poetry and abstract fiction. This text features themes like relationships, feminism, and survival. Rupi Kaur is well known among a wide range of readers and is very well known on social media. On Instagram, she posts her poetry along with posts promoting social change in India, Canada, and society as a whole. So the first one I'll be reading is titled To All Young Poets. It offers inspiration to those who want to write poetry and refers to poetry as art. Your art is not about how many people like your work. Your art is about if your heart likes your work, if your soul likes your work. It's about how honest you are with yourself, and you must never trade honesty for relatability. And then the second piece I'll be reading is titled I Want to Apologize to All the Women, and it's a poem discussing the value of understanding what truly makes up a person outside of personal appearance. I want to apologize to all the women I have called pretty before I've called them intelligent or brave. I am sorry I made it sound as though something as simple as what you're born with is the most you have to be proud of, when your spirit has crushed mountains. From now on, I will say things like you are resilient or you are extraordinary, not because I don't think you're pretty, but because you are so much more than that.
My name is Melody Reed. I'm a senior and I'm majoring in, that's not me. I'm majoring in literary studies here at MSSU, and I am very honored to serve as our chapter's president. Before I get to my selection, Maya was supposed to read a selection of poems and included some French poetry. She's not feeling well, so I just wanted to give a brief introduction of the pieces, and you should have the French or the English translation of these poems in your seat. The token Quebec Franglais, code switching between French and English, is emulated in Michel Lalonde's poem Speak White. Lalonde was born in Montreal in 1937 and died there in 2021. She wrote and first recited this poem in 1968 at an event for the Poèmes et Chansons de la Résistance. I do not speak French, I apologize. This was a series of 3 events in support of the imprisoned leaders of the Quebecois separatist group, Front de Libération de Québec, and again in 1970 at La Nuit de la Poissée. The term Speak White was an insult to the Francophone Canadians, and the act of speaking Quebecois became a statement in itself of, quote, cultural survival, aspiration, and communion, end quote. Speak White is a manifesto against economic and political oppression and humiliation and the denigration of the French language and the imposition of the Anglo-Saxon language and culture. The following poem, Speak White, Speak What, written by Italo-Quebecois poet Marco Mécomb in 1989, directly parodying Lalonde's Speak White, and in response to the passage of the Charter of the French Language of 1977, establishing French as the official language of the Quebec government. Mécomb was born in Italy in 1945 and emigrated to Quebec in 1958. He was an advocate for its national sovereignty and continues to be outspoken about immigration. Mécomb reiterates in a 2021 interview the sentiment of his titular, On n'est pas Québécois, on le devient. Quote, one isn't born Québécois, one becomes it. End quote. That there are more similarities between an immigrant and a Quebecois from the same social conditions than between an underprivileged and a privileged person of the same culture, end quote. He suggests in Speak What that immigrants have taken the place of the Francophone Canadian minority's brunt of oppression and reminds them of their resemblance. Today, I am reading two excerpts from the exciting and best-selling post-apocalyptic novel Moon of the Crusted Snow by Waubgeshig Rice. Sorry, the French has thrown me. Rice is an author and journalist from the Wasauksing First Nation. He has won the Independent Publishers Book Award in 2021 and the Anishinaabeg Nation Debowin Citation for Excellence in First Nation Writing in 2014. Rice grew up in the small community of Wasauksing First Nation on the island of Georgian Bay on Lake Huron. He graduated with a degree in journalism from the Toronto Metropolitan University in 2002 and worked as a broadcast journalist and wrote in his spare time for many years. He recently retired from journalism to focus on his writing, which he holds has been shaped by his First Nation heritage and their oral tradition. Quote, I was fortunate to grow up in a time when my home community was reclaiming and reconnecting with Anishinaabe culture and stories, and those experiences have heavily informed and influenced the storytelling journey I'm on today, end quote. Moon of the Crusted Snow was published in 2018 and made the 2023 Canada Reads Longlist selection, is the winner of the 2019 OLA Forest of Reading Evergreen Award, was shortlisted for the 2019 John W. Campbell Memorial Award, as well as the 2018-2020 First Nation Communities Read Indigenous Literature Award. It is also a national bestseller. The novel follows a First Nation family and community as they rely on each other, their Anishinaabe traditions, and their knowledge of the land to survive and maintain their cultural principles when society crumbles. Rice beautifully weaves the tradition and customs, stories of the Wasauksing First Nation into his story of survival while simultaneously asking what it means to be human, all set against the wild and beautiful terrain of the rural Lake Huron region. Evan reached into the right pocket of his cargo pants and pulled out a small leather pouch, faded and smooth from years of wear. He brought it up to just below his chest and balanced it in the center of his palm. He ran his thumb across the small beaded pattern in the middle, feeling where the beads were missing in the simple bear design. I'll ask Auntie to rebead this later this fall, he thought. Evan looked down at the beautiful design, a black bear in a red circle edged in white. At least half the outer white beads were gone, and there was a bald patch near the bear's head and hind legs. Most of the beaded bear itself remained, though. He untied the leather string and pinched some tobacco into his open palm. It came from a plastic pouch of rolling tobacco he brought from the trading post on the way out. He'd forgotten to get the dry, untreated tobacco, or sema, from his medicine bundle before leaving. The shredded, manufactured leaves seemed to gum together. He bounced the tiny heap in his left hand before wrapping his fingers around it. He closed his eyes. Gichi Manadu, he said aloud. Great Spirit, today I miigwech for the life you have given us. He inhaled deeply and paused. This was still a little new to him. Miigwech for my family and for my community. Miigwech for our health. Chi miigwech for the life you have allowed me to take today, this muzu, to feed my family. He still felt a little awkward, saying this prayer of thanks mostly in English, with only a few Ojibwe words peppered here and there. But it still made him feel good to believe that he was giving back in some way. Evan expressed thanks for the good life he was trying to lead. He apologized for not being able to pray fluently in his native language and asked for a bountiful fall hunting season for everyone. He promised to keep trying to live in a good way, despite the pull of negative influences around him. He finished his fit prayer with a resounding, solitary miigwech before putting the tobacco on the ground in front of the moose. This was his offering of gratitude to the Creator and the Mother Earth for allowing him to take this life. As he took from the earth, he gave back. It was the Anishinaabe way, as he understood it. I'm picking up in the middle of a scene where the grandfather is sharing a story of their culture with the grandchildren. So I'm kind of in the middle, but you're not missing much. Dan picked the story back up. So the geese were leaving for the winter. Do you know the Anishinaabe word for winter? Nagone's hand shot up. Baboon! Hey, yes, my girl, that's right, good job. He looked above them to see Evan, Nicole, and Patricia smiling on the couch. To conserve precious resources, the families did most things together, rotating the housing responsibilities. The idea was to save on firewood and food by living more communally. So anyways, the geese were all dancing around and singing. Dan's gestures became more animated as the story's action built. They were very plump because they had to eat a lot for their journey south. They needed lots of energy to fly that far. Nana Bush started licking his lips. Look at all these geese, he thought. There's enough to get me through the winter, and they're so fat. Nana Bush was the trickster, so he started to think of a plan to trick them. My brothers and sisters, he said, let me join you in your celebration. I want to wish you well on your journey to the south, so I'd like to offer you a dance. It goes like this. You have to close your eyes and spin around in a circle. You have to keep your wings by your side. It's like you're imagining yourself in your warm new home for the winter. Dan stood up and demonstrated the move for the children. They giggled as he spun around with his eyes closed and a silly grin on his face. So the geese said okay, and they started to dance like Nana Bush showed them. He looked around, and they all were spinning in circles with their eyes closed. He walked up to the big one closest to him that he'd been talking to. He kept real quiet and slowly moved his hand down the goose's neck. He mimicked the motion, leaning forward and peering into the kids' eyes. They sat totally still. Then he wrung his neck. He thrust his hands forward in threatening grips and startled them. Then he sneaked over to the next closest one and did the same thing. And then the next one and the next. They were all dancing with their eyes closed and singing, so they didn't hear him. At the end of his evil trick, there were 30 geese lying there dead. Now I won't go hungry this winter, he thought to himself. Despite their grandfather's jovial tone, Nangoan's and Maingan's eyes slid over to their parents, who continued to sip their tea unconcerned. So Nana Bush took all the dead geese out of the bush and piled them up by the shoreline. Dan went on. He stacked them neatly. It was a long day, and he was really hungry, so he started a fire to cook the geese. I am so hungry, and I am so tired, he said, but I'm happy with my new bounty for the winter. I have all this food for myself. But he was so tired, and he knew it would take some time to cook the first fat goose that he just stuck in the fire. So he decided to take a little nap. To make sure he woke up in time, he asked his Diosh, his bum, to wake him up. His bum, squealed Nangoan. Yes, his bum. Both children kicked back in laughter. Nana Bush turned back and looked at his Diosh and said, okay, Diosh, you better wake me up. I don't want to burn that goose. I'm just going to have a quick sleep. You make sure it turns out okay. Nana Bush looked right at the fire. Then he slept for a really long time. longer than he wanted to. Then all of a sudden he woke up. He was startled because the sun was starting to set and his Dioche hadn't woken him up. Nana Bush looked right at the fire. It had become really big. He saw the goose's long legs sticking out of the fire on the rocks. He went to grab them to pull them out, but the legs were all that was left. The goose was in there for so long it totally burned up. He looked at the legs in each of his hands and got really mad. Then he remembered the rest of the geese. He turned around quickly and saw the whole pile was gone. Something had came and took them all while he was asleep. "Dioche," he yelled, "you were supposed to keep an eye out. Now my supper is burnt and our food for the whole winter is gone." Nana Bush was so mad that he wanted to punish his Dioche for not doing the job he asked it to. "I know," he said. "I'm going to put you in the fire as punishment for not following my orders. You'll know from now on to listen to me." So Nana Bush sat down on the edge of the fire pit and put his Dioche in the fire. "He put his bum in the fire?" said Maingan. "Why would he want to hurt himself?" Dan tilted his head sideways and continued. It did start to hurt. It only took a few seconds, and Nana Bush's Dioche was totally on fire. "Ah!" he screamed. He jumped up really fast and started running around in circles. He sprung from his chair and shuffled quickly around the kid's spot on the floor, circling them while holding his butt. High-pitched laughter soared through the room. He was panicking. Dan raised his voice, standing in front of them. His Dioche was on fire, and he needed to put it out. But he was too far from the water just to jump in, so he ran and jumped bum first onto the rocks and slid down. He kept sliding down the rocks on his Dioche until the fire was out. He kept going until all the burnt skin came off his Dioche. He paused and sat back. "So you know all those green things you see on the rocks in the summertime? Some are like little plants. Some just look like skin on the rock." The children both nodded. "That's from Nana Bush's burnt bum. When he slid down the rocks, it left all that behind. Some people call that green stuff moss and lichen." Evan spoke up behind them. "Neat, eh? Can you think of any other important lessons in that story?" I know, said Meningen, shooting up his hand. "What's that?" "Don't be greedy. Don't be greedy," Nangoans echoed. "That's right," Evan said. "And always be ready for winter."
Hi, my name is Isabel Walker, and I am the Public Relations Officer for our chapter of Sigma Tau Delta. I am a senior graduating in December with a BA in English, Literary Studies, and minors in both creative writing and sociology. I intend to attend graduate school to further explore and entertain my love of literature and writing following graduation. I want to thank all of my professors in the Literature and Language Department for stimulating my continued interest in literature and providing me with such a valuable education. I will be reading three pieces. The first is an excerpt from Johnny Appleseed by Joshua Whitehead. That book is also available in the library. Joshua Whitehead is an OG Cree, Two-Spirit, Indigiqueer member of Peguis First Nation. His works include Johnny Appleseed, his poetry collection, Full Metal Indigiqueer, and his newest collection of essays, Making Love with the Land. In his writing, his goal is to center queer Indigenous voices. For example, Whitehead asserts he wrote Johnny Appleseed, quote, "with the goal of showing you that Two-Spirit and queer Indigenous folks are not a was, that we are not the ethnographic and romanticized notation of revered mystic or shamanic. Instead, we are an is and a coming." Whitehead is currently an associate professor of Indigenous Studies and English at the University of Calgary on Treaty 7 territory. Johnny Appleseed was also the 2021 Canada Reads winner. This is from the first chapter of Johnny Appleseed. "I figured out that I was gay when I was 8. I liked to stay up late after everyone went to bed and watch Queer as Folk on my Kokum's TV. She had a satellite and all the channels pirated, of course. At the time, my mom and I were living with my kokum because my dad had left us. I think he took Loretta Lynn a little too seriously because one day he never did come home after drinking. Queer as Folk was on at midnight. I muted the channel with the subtitles turned on so no one would hear it, and turned down the brightness so the glaring light wouldn't shine underneath their doors like the goddamn poltergeist. I loved QAF. I wanted to be one of those gay men living their fabulous lives in Pittsburgh. I wanted to live in a loft and go to gay bars and dance with cute boys and fool around in glory holes. I wanted to work in a comic shop or a university. I wanted to be sexy and rich. I wanted that. When I got a little older, I think I was 15, I remember watching Dan Savage and Terry Miller on the internet telling me that it gets better. They told me that they knew what I was going through, that they knew me. How so, I thought. You don't know me. You know lattes and condominiums. You don't know what it's like being a brown gay boy on the res. Hell, I'd never even seen a Starbucks, and I sure as hell couldn't tell you why a small coffee is called tall. You see, I've never liked my name, Johnny. My parents named me after my dad, a residential school survivor, alcoholic, and would-be country star. I never heard from him again after he left. We found out later that he died in a fire on another res. I really don't care. People don't forget those stories, you know. Random people would ask me, "Oh, you're so-and-so's boy, the drunk?" And to top off the name shaming, one summer I went to this Christian day camp called Camp Arnis. Our counselor, Stephen, would always make us sing a song before we ate our meals. It was called Johnny Appleseed. Well, it was at that same camp that I kissed my first boyfriend, Lewis, a silver fox who was a camp counselor like Stephen, and as we made out in my bunk in Red Fox Bay, one of Lewis's coworkers walked in on us. Turns out Lewis had this girlfriend in Quincy Bay, and when we got caught, he got all up in arms and blamed me for coming on to him. A few hours later, everyone at the camp heard about the incident and started calling me Johnny Rottenseed. Then, lo and behold, during our pre-meal prayer, no one had their eyes closed or their heads bowed. They were all glaring at me and whispering to each other with disgust and paranoia on their faces. Even at the age of 10, a native can become a gay predator, apparently. When I got back to the res, I did some research about my namesake at our shoddy little makeshift library. There was no Dewey Decimal System there. Books were scattered in piles that were designated as Pile A, the Cosmos, Pile B, Pegwis Fisherman yearbooks, and Pile C, random shit. So it made being a Nancy Drew especially difficult. It turns out that Johnny Appleseed is some American folk legend who became famous by planting apple trees in West Virginia. I didn't understand why we'd sung about him at camp. I wanted to know about Louis Riel, Chief Pegwis, and Buffy St. Marie, but instead, we were honoring some white man throwing apple seeds in frontier America. Apparently, he was this moral martyr figure who remained a virgin in exchange for the promise of 2 wives in heaven. All I know is this. Apples are crazy expensive on the res, and they had now become bad things in my head. My stepdad Roger called me an apple when I told him I wanted to leave the res. "You're red on the outside," he said, "and white on the inside." And then I am also reading 2 pieces by Jillian Christmas. Jillian Christmas is a queer Afro-Caribbean Canadian poet, writer, and activist who currently lives on the unceded territories of the Squamish, Tsleil-Waututh, and Musqueam people. Christmas explores themes of anti-colonialism, identity, race, sexuality, among others in her first poetry collection, The Gospel of Breaking, that includes poems such as The Gospel of Breaking and Falling in Love, published in 2020. According to the Vancouver Art Gallery, quote, Christmas made history as the first Canadian to reach the finals of the World Poetry Slam in 2015, performing her slam poem, Black Feminist. A brief aside, I highly recommend looking up this performance on the internet. It's really good. And in 2021, she was the recipient of the League of Canadian Poets Sherry D. Wilson Golden Beret Award for Spoken Word Poetry and Dane Ogilvie Prize for LGBTQ Canadian Writers. Christmas served as Vancouver's Art Gallery's poet in residence from November 2023 to the spring of this year. The first poem I will be reading is called The Gospel of Breaking. Dear God, is it wrong that so long after our separation I will see your face everywhere? The holy water between my legs when she touches me, the wet in her eyes, head pressed back, her sinner mouth too full of heaven. This bruised new city, springing with all the wrong kinds of love and all the best company to enjoy it in. I was birthed into a church too comfortable with a God who would make closets into coffins. But I have been born again into the religion of lost souls, baptized under bourbon-kissed streetlight, anointed in smoke plumes. There is laughter and blood in my cheek, and more than enough of it to feed the masses today. I see you in every busted lip and backroom handjob, my God, who has been so quiet. This must be your work, as baffling as all your other mercies. And to close, this second poem is called Falling in Love in Love. Once, while in São Miguel, I swam in tiny ocean inside of the ocean. It was a breakwater that created a pool separating this little sea from its extended family, only by a circling wall of rocks that opened briefly on one end to let the water flow in and out. The ocean water there was so salty that I bounced around and floated with ease. For every moment I could spare in that day, I flung my arms out in front, then back behind me, moving acrobatically through my private deep. The day was cool, and the shallow bits of water warmed my skin. I wanted to stay forever in the double boiler, but eventually I returned to the cobbled roads. Thinking back on it now, it is the only way I know to describe the feeling of falling in love while in love. I cannot say who is the big sea and who is the small. The water ebbs and flows like lovers tend to do, changing shape and warmth, pulling me gently toward and away. The waves of one did not fight the other, but fed each other, become part of each other. Though unique, each played a role in lifting me up. I suppose you could keep them apart if you wanted to. I suppose you could have one without the other, call a pool, and leave it at that. But there is also, and especially, something beautiful in holding two blue seas in your glittering palms and calling them both home. Okay, well, thank you to everyone who joined us, both in person and virtually. Thank you to Amber Carr especially, and Spivey Library for providing us with refreshments and allowing us to use the quiet room for this event. This collection of voices does not represent the entirety of Canadian literature, but we hope we were able to provide you with a snapshot of the rich history, rich literary history, of Canada. If you're interested in diving further into Canadian literature, on the back of the program, we listed multiple additional authors and texts that we think are valuable reads. For our virtual audience, I posted the program on Facebook in the event that I created, so you're able to access this list as well. Thank you again for joining us for this exploration of Canadian literature, and we hope you enjoyed it as much as we did.